if one is thinking more narrowly about, which is, which it can be narrow, can be sometimes convenient for some things, more narrowly, in terms of the group of intellectuals that I mentioned before, who have come together and who have sort of adopted more or less that designation. There is that way of speaking about it. That's the more narrow. The more open is that, modernity, coloniality, these themes go back centuries. And so I think that a number of us claim that the genealogy goes centuries back to people who may or may not have identified with whatever we're doing, but we're claiming them anyway. So the narrow one, the one that speaks about the number of intellectuals who have been in dialogue about this, I think and there are others who can also say, and this will be my version. I think that here, very centrally to it, was the presence of Aníbal Quijano, or the work of Quijano, for this group. Because Aníbal Quijano, this Peruvian sociologist, was the intellectual who began to use this concept of coloniality. That became fundamental, in a way became a thread that allowed a number of us and a number of others that were reflecting about similar issues of colonization or oppression or the third world, or the condition of being third world, part of the third world. Coloniality, I think, allowed the possibility to theorize about it from another angle and maybe from a larger scope also. Right. A lot of theory is coming up with concepts that help you to faster than otherwise, bring up a number of ideas together and build new conceptual bridges with that. Right? Just like in computers, you said that this, you're all used to the iPhone 1, iPhone 2, iPhone 3, all these advances in technology. And this is, of course, because both at the level of software and hardware, there are a number of advances, and now they create a smaller chip that is able to do more than before. And on the basis of that chip, they can do a more advanced phone, right? So sometimes I think you can think by analogy, a little bit, use that analogy to understand theoretical developments. That sometimes you have these sort of concepts that actually are the equivalent of the smaller chip that they put in the phone. And once you use now this concept, like the small chip, you can build something more complex, faster, and discover new things that you didn't think were possible before. Like with the new version of the phone, right? We have to be careful though, because not everything that sounds like a new concept is, and some new concepts can be worse than other ones. So it's not like we have a verifiable way of confirming whether this concept is actually helping us move forward or is taking us back. That is one of the main differences with how technology works. Because the microchip, you can use it, and if it's faster, the machine says it's faster, processes data and information faster, then that's a better chip. It's smaller, you can see it, but in theory, in the human sciences in general, it is more difficult because you don't know. So what you have to do is, you use it, you test it, and see. And you test it and you share it. And in the case of decolonial thinking, you share the new constructs, not only with other people who have been also thinking about the same things, but also with activists, with artists, with other people in other communities, to see if it resonates, to see if it helps them to think faster, better, perhaps have other kind of concept, notions, ideas about how power works and how resistance can be. This is the other thing, that these concepts are meant to help us understand better, but ultimately also to develop better strategies to contest power. So that concept of coloniality was formulated by Aníbal Quijano. And I think that it served as one of these concepts that was able to encapsulate in it many of the operations that many of us had to do. Maybe before we had to write 35 pages to get to the idea. Now with coloniality, we have it there. Plus, it allows us to connect with this, with that, with this, with that at the same time. So it helped us to in that enormously. And with that, we have been fleshing out the different dimensions and layers of that concept. It takes a while, right? And maybe we will develop more soon, different. But this has been very useful so far. Now, this concept, of course, you cannot understand it without understanding the work of previous intellectuals who did not use the concept itself, but who were using perhaps colonialism or neo-colonialization. So the idea is not that this concept now displaces all of those other theories who were only using colonization. Right? That's not where the debate stands. Actually, when you read many of those figures, what you see is that they were already talking about coloniality and decoloniality before the names were invented. And for that reason, I in particular, sometimes I speak about decolonization, and sometimes about decoloniality, or colonization or coloniality. I begin to change them a little bit. And you could do that in a way. They are technically different concepts, because colonialism typically is considered to be the socio-historical processes of some empires expanding and getting colonized. Right? So it means that there is a core, that there is a geopolitical core, there is a geopolitical periphery, and that colonization, that's it. With coloniality, we talk about relations of power that can continue to exist even after that formal relation of colonization is over. Okay? So we're not talking exactly the same thing. But when you go back to some of the theoreticians of colonization, they were not thinking about colonization in that very reductive way that then many social scientists began to think about it. They were already talking about something else, relations of power, in a complex way. But within that coloniality, to begin with, it helps to distinguish the common usage of the social scientists that speak about colonization. Or when you speak about, for instance, colonization, decolonization, or post-colonialism, and they tend to think that, particularly if it's about decolonization, it's like, well, that was like 50 years ago. It's like, this is like a historical project, and you already dated because you're working back. And how many of us see it is that those are unfinished processes, just like defacialization, for instance. Unfinished processes that are still being fleshed out. That is to say that that's why I would put Quijano in a way, and he began with this idea around 1987. He began, I think that the reason for that is twofold. On the one hand, or threefold, very quickly. On the one hand, there were developments inside Latin American sociology of dependency. In Latin America, there was a sociology of exploitation, of liberation, a Latin American sociology that began to contest the sociological frameworks that came from the United States pre-model. Then that led to the sociology of dependency, and that a reflection of the third world in relation to the first world. But it led to, in some moments, it led to an impasse. Many believe that it was taking the economic model to apply it to everything. And so ultimately, it's sort of so some of the people who were theorizing with it realized that no, it's not proper. And then, there was something, the left was in profound crisis from the 70s, 80s. Then you had 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union, and suddenly Marxism and communism you may still believe in them, but they don't still have the same ring. So Quijano comes as a Marxist from Latin America that is facing the crisis of the left and the crisis of Marxism globally. One, the crisis of the Latin American dependency discourse. Two, that by itself, meaning that all his work of decades, he looks around and everywhere is in crisis. People are, discarding the concept. People are becoming neoliberal by the second, or liberal. Someone declaring the end of history, and there you are, still believing in history, and change is possible. So, what do you do? So this is the late 80s, but then something is beginning to happen. And it's the 500th anniversary of the so-called discovery of the Americas in 1992. And I think that that's the third element. The fact that already in the late 80s, Latin American intellectuals and indigenous intellectuals and indigenous activists are already looking at 1992. And many indigenous activists in the world are like that, are like waiting. Are you going to celebrate that? Tell me that you're not going to. They're like, wait, man, 1985, okay, it's coming 7 years from now. 1986, 1987 is coming. Now a demonstration in that plaza, a demonstration here, a demonstration there, a little manifesto, and 1992 is approaching, and to see with what kind of indecent ideas and discourses will the hegemonic minorities will come when they celebrate or they mark this anniversary, 500 years. Will you really celebrate? So I think that that was the third element that entered into Quijano's. It's coming from Peru. There is in Latin America, it was an important 1992. Right? That moment was very significant. So many intellectuals begin to think about 1992. But not only about 1992 in a context, again, where when global leftist discourse is in crisis and hegemonic Latin American sociological discourse is also in crisis. Like it took those two major forms of contestatory discourse to be beaten down for the question of the 500th anniversary and the voices of indigenous people and that protest to actually be able to have an effect on the theory. You see? Because 1992 was so close to 1989, if that hadn't been so, maybe Quijano and other of the leftists would have been joining the right wings against the indigenous masses who were, I'm exaggerating a little bit here. But if leftist discourse had not been in such a crisis, if people would be following up, people like Quijano and other theoreticians to say, what is the next crisis of capitalism? And when will the triumph of communism will come? 1992 would be like a bare, something minimal of interest. It's like that little thing. No, they would be like, well, no, when these indigenous people know that when communism happens, then all the problems will be solved away. Right? If only they join. So maybe 1992 would have been about creating schools, Marxist schools for indigenous people, so that they finally realize that and if we join the Soviet Union, then we have a chance, and Cuba, then we have a chance of really transforming. Right? So, I see a little serious about that part. I don't think that without that crisis of the left, we have had the level of innovation in theory and on questions of colonialism and decolonization that have taken place in the last 25 years. They would not be there. You need a massive form of disenchantment with a dominant form of theory. You need sort of social conditions that are telling you, you better adjust, you better change, this doesn't seem to work. And a desperate need to find something new. To then maybe something that was very old, registered. And oh, damn it, yes, maybe. So in a way, the question of the 500 years, so-called discovering colonization of the so-called New World, became a key to theorize anew. Questions of dependency, questions of oppression, question of capitalism, and all of this. And I think that, again, if narrowly, I think that coincidence in the late 80s, early 90s, became that moment that was key for the modern decoloniality network.